Abandoned by all, Christopher stared at the mansion's emptied walls, yesterday's titan of industry, today's disgraced pariah. Only Rosa remained, the maid who'd witnessed his 20-year ascent before this brutal billionaire's fall from grace. Her weathered hands held evidence of his innocence and something far more valuable, unwavering loyalty when the world turned cold. The morning newspapers arrived with the precision of executioners, each headline driving another nail into the coffin of Christopher Harrington's carefully constructed life. 57 years of strategic decisions, networking at the highest levels of society, and building an empire that stretched across continents, all reduced to a series of damning accusations splashed across the front pages in merciless black and white. The financial scandal had erupted with volcanic force 3 weeks prior, but today brought confirmation that the board had voted unanimously to remove him as CEO of Harrington Global, the company he had built from nothing over 3 decades of relentless work and sacrifice. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined, particularly from board members who had broken bread at his table, who had celebrated birthdays and holidays within the very walls of this mansion that would soon be stripped from him as well. The cavernous living room, once a showcase of his success with its soaring ceilings and museum-quality art collection, now echoed with emptiness as staff had departed in droves at the first whiff of scandal. Only the essential furniture remained, the rest having been catalogued for the inevitable auction that would follow legal proceedings. Christopher stood motionless by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured gardens that would soon fall into disrepair without the team of landscapers who had tendered their resignations via email rather than face him. His reflection in the glass revealed a man he barely recognized, shoulders hunched where they had once been squared with confidence, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights, silver hair unkempt where it had once been immaculately groomed as befitted a man of his stature. The custom Italian suit hung loosely on his frame, evidence of meals left untouched as his appetite vanished along with his fortune. The ping of his phone announced another withdrawal from his rapidly diminishing inner circle, another fair-weather friend offering transparent excuses about prior commitments that would prevent them from seeing him through this unfortunate situation. He didn't bother to read the message fully, simply noting the name, his tennis partner of 15 years, before tossing the device onto a nearby settee with a bitter laugh that sounded foreign to his own ears. The pattern had become predictable, almost methodical in its cruelty. First, the business associates with their concerns about optics and shareholder confidence. Then, the social acquaintances with their suddenly full calendars. And finally, the inner circle who had professed loyalty and friendship while drinking his finest wines and enjoying the privileges of proximity to wealth and power. What remained was the crushing silence of a 22,000-square-foot home designed for entertaining, for impressing, for showcasing. Never for the stark reality of solitude that now engulfed him like a shroud. The prosecutors had frozen most of his accounts pending investigation, leaving him with access to a fraction of his former resources, an amount that seemed vast by normal standards, but woefully inadequate to maintain the infrastructure of his previous existence. The legal fees alone had already consumed a significant portion of his available funds, and his attorneys made no promises about the outcome of a case that was as much about public perception as actual evidence. The irony was not lost on him that he was innocent of the specific charges leveled against him, yet guilty of the arrogance and carelessness that had created the perfect conditions for others to orchestrate his downfall. The soft sound of footsteps pulled him from his spiral of recrimination, and he turned to see Rosa entering the room with her characteristic quiet efficiency. At 54, she had been a constant in his household for nearly 2 decades, outlasting 3 marriages and countless redecorations of the mansion as his tastes evolved with his increasing wealth. Her simple black uniform was as pressed and proper as it had been in more prosperous times, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in its customary bun, her expression revealing nothing of what she must think of his spectacular fall from grace. She carried a tray with his afternoon tea, maintaining the routines and rituals of the household, with a steadfastness that seemed almost absurd against the backdrop of his collapsing world, yet somehow provided the only anchor to normalcy in days that had become increasingly unmoored from all he had known. "I've prepared your Earl Grey, Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice carrying the faint traces of her childhood in a working-class neighborhood, an accent she had never fully shed, despite years in the rarefied atmosphere of his home. "And there are some documents that arrived for you by courier. I've placed them beside your cup." There was something in her tone that caught his attention, a quality he couldn't quite identify, but that seemed important. Though in his current state of mental exhaustion and emotional depletion, he couldn't summon the energy to examine it closely. Instead, he nodded his acknowledgement, watching as she set the tray on the coffee table with practiced precision, wondering vaguely if she too would soon depart, leaving him truly and completely alone in the echoing emptiness of what had once been the crowning achievement of his success, but now felt like nothing more than an elaborate mausoleum for his former self. The courier envelope remained unopened for hours, yet another harbinger of bad news that Christopher lacked the fortitude to face after a day of cascading disasters. Evening shadows lengthened across the marble floors of the grand entrance hall as he paced the perimeter of his shrinking kingdom, telephone pressed to his ear while his last remaining financial advisor delivered the coup de grace to whatever hope he had harbored of weathering this storm intact. The Swiss accounts had been located by the prosecution, the shell companies in the Caymans unraveled with suspicious efficiency, and the complex web of investments that had protected his wealth now lay exposed and vulnerable to the circling predators of the legal system. With each revelation, the noose tightened further around his neck, not through any action he had taken, but through an elaborate frame that had been years in the making, engineered with such precision that even he could almost believe in his own guilt when presented with the fabricated evidence. Terminating the call without the customary pleasantries that had once oiled the machinery of his business relationships, Christopher slumped onto the bottom step of the sweeping staircase, head in hands, the crushing weight of inevitability pressing down upon him with physical force. The house around him, once a source of immense pride with its custom millwork, imported stone, and museum-quality finishes, now seemed to mock him with its extravagance, each luxurious detail a testament to the pride before the fall. He had acquired possessions with the assumption that they represented achievement, security, success, never considering that everything could vanish with such breathtaking speed, leaving him clutching at shadows and memories in place of tangible power. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. He who had prided himself on seeing the angles, anticipating market shifts, and outmaneuvering competitors had been blindsided by the most fundamental betrayal. The sound of quiet activity from the kitchen penetrated his fog of self-recrimination, a reminder that one person remained in his household staff where once there had been 14. Rosa had given no indication of intending to leave, continuing her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her service since the day he had hired her on the recommendation of his first wife's cousin. At the time, he had barely registered her presence beyond confirming that the household ran smoothly under her management, that meals appeared when required, that his clothes were immaculately maintained, and that the complex logistics of his social calendar were executed without hiccups that might reflect poorly on his carefully cultivated image. She had been background noise in the symphony of his success, essential but unacknowledged, like the foundation of a building that supports everything yet remains unseen and unthanked. Rising from his impromptu seat with joints that protested more than they had in his youth, Christopher followed the sounds to the kitchen. a part of his home he had rarely entered except for the occasional late-night foray for a snack, or when hosting casual gatherings, where he played at being accessible by preparing simple dishes for impressed guests. The space was a chef's dream, designed with no expense spared. Viking appliances, marble countertops, custom cabinetry, and a walk-in refrigerator that had often been stocked to capacity for entertaining. Now the expansive refrigerator contained only the basics, a visual representation of how quickly abundance could contract to subsistence when fortune withdrew her favor. Rosa stood at the island, efficiently chopping vegetables for what appeared to be a simple soup, her movements practiced and economical, wasting no motion as she prepared a meal that was a far cry from the gastronomic experiences his former private chef had created. "You don't need to stay, Rosa," Christopher said, the words emerging more abruptly than he had intended, rough-edged with the emotion he struggled to contain. "There won't be funds to pay you by the end of the month. Everyone else has had the sense to abandon this sinking ship." He attempted a smile that felt more like a grimace, leaning against the doorframe with forced casualness that did nothing to disguise the tension radiating from his body. "I'd write you a letter of recommendation, but I suspect my name would do you more harm than good in the current climate." The bitterness seeped through despite his attempt at light-hearted delivery, the reality of his toxic status in social and professional circles, still a raw wound that bled afresh with each new rejection, each unanswered call, each former friend who crossed the street to avoid an awkward encounter with the disgraced titan of industry. Rosa paused in her chopping, setting down the knife with deliberate care before turning to face him fully for perhaps the first time in their long association. Her dark eyes held a steadiness that caught him off guard, an assessing quality that made him uncomfortably aware that she was seeing him, truly seeing him, not as the employer or the billionaire or the social figure, but as the man stripped of pretense by circumstance. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Harrington," she said with quiet certainty that brooked no argument, her tone suggesting this was simply a fact of the universe, as immutable as gravity. "I've prepared your dinner. When you're ready to eat, we need to discuss the contents of that envelope you've been avoiding. There are things you should know, things I've been gathering for longer than you might imagine." With that enigmatic statement, she turned back to her task, leaving Christopher staring at her back with the dawning realization that there were dimensions to this woman he had never bothered to explore, complexities beneath the surface he had presumed was all there was to know. The dining room table, an expanse of polished mahogany that had hosted senators, celebrities, and captains of industry, now felt absurdly oversized with just Christopher seated at one end, a solitary island in a sea of empty chairs that once accommodated 24 for elaborate dinner parties orchestrated down to the last detail. The soup Rosa had prepared steamed gently before him, a simple offering of vegetables and herbs from the kitchen garden she had maintained at the edge of the property. A garden he had only vaguely been aware existed until this moment of forced simplicity. The courier envelope lay beside his water glass, still sealed, its contents unknown yet looming with ominous potential in a week where every communication had brought fresh disaster. He had followed Rosa's suggestion to eat first with the docility of a man too exhausted by circumstance to assert preferences, finding unexpected comfort in the honest simplicity of the meal after years of elaborate cuisine that had impressed his palate without ever truly satisfying some deeper hunger he had never acknowledged. "You should open it now," Rosa said, appearing at his elbow with the quiet efficiency that had characterized her presence in his home for nearly 2 decades. She didn't wait for his response or permission, instead taking the seat to his right, a breach of the invisible barrier between employer and employee that would have been unthinkable in the carefully stratified world he had inhabited until 3 weeks ago. The normality had been swept away by the tsunami of scandal, leaving them in uncharted territory where the old rules seemed suddenly arbitrary and meaningless. Her eyes held steady on his face, watchful and assessing in a way that made him realize she'd always observed him this carefully, but he had been too self-absorbed to notice the intelligence and awareness behind her habitually reserved expression. Something fundamental had shifted between them, though he couldn't precisely identify when or how the change had occurred. With fingers that betrayed a slight tremor, another unfamiliar weakness in a man who had prided himself on unwavering confidence, Christopher slit open the envelope and withdrew a thick sheaf of documents. Legal language swimming before his eyes in dense paragraphs interspersed with highlighted sections. "What is this?" he asked, confusion furrowing his brow as he struggled to make sense of the technical terminology that seemed to reference accounts and transactions he had never authorized or been aware of. The letterhead belonged to a law firm he didn't recognize, not one of the prestigious outfits that had handled his business for years before abruptly terminating their services when the scandal broke. This was a small practice, with an address in a working-class neighborhood across the city, worlds away from the gleaming downtown towers where his legal matters had previously been managed with appropriate grandeur and corresponding invoices. "Evidence?" Rosa replied, her voice taking on a quality he had never heard before. Authoritative, certain, with none of the deference that had colored their interactions throughout their long association. "I've been collecting it for over 2 years, ever since I overheard a conversation between Mr. Whitmore and Mr. Dennison in the garden room during the Christmas party." The names struck Christopher like physical blows. His CFO and his closest business partner, both of whom had been among the first to distance themselves when allegations surfaced. Both of whom had provided damaging testimony to investigators with apparent reluctance that, in retrospect, seemed calculated for maximum effect. They didn't notice the maid refilling the ice bucket, of course. No one ever really sees the help. A smile touched her lips, not bitter but almost satisfied, as though this invisibility had proven an unexpected advantage in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. What followed was a methodical explanation that revealed dimensions to Rosa that Christopher struggled to reconcile with the woman who had quietly managed his household affairs for years. She spoke of financial discrepancies she had noted while organizing his personal papers, of patterns that emerged when she gathered discarded documents from his home office wastebasket, of conversations overhead in fragments as she moved invisibly through rooms where powerful men discussed sensitive matters without registering her presence. With each revelation, the picture became clearer, an elaborate conspiracy orchestrated by his inner circle to siphon funds through complex channels, creating a paper trail that would implicate him while enriching themselves, timed perfectly to coincide with market conditions that would make the allegations seem plausible to investigators already primed to believe the worst of successful men who had risen too far, too fast for comfort. They were thorough, she acknowledged, tapping a finger against a particularly damning document that he now understood had been entirely fabricated. But they didn't account for someone watching from the shadows, someone with nothing to gain and no stake in their power games. Christopher stared at her, truly seeing her perhaps for the first time since she had entered his employ. The intelligence in her dark eyes, the strength in her posture that he had mistaken for proper servile deportment, the keen mind that had been observing and analyzing while he and others like him had dismissed her as part of the furniture. "Why?" he asked, the single word encompassing a universe of questions he couldn't articulate fully. Why help him when everyone else had abandoned him? Why invest years in gathering evidence that didn't benefit her in any tangible way? Why reveal herself now when his power and influence had been stripped away, leaving him with nothing to offer in return? The woman sitting across from him had suddenly become a mystery where before she had been merely a function, and the revelation of his own blindness was perhaps the most humbling aspect of an experience already characterized by profound humiliation. The kitchen table became their war room in the days that followed. a humble command center where Christopher and Rosa spread documents across the wooden surface that had previously served only the household staff for their meals and breaks. The polished dining room with its imposing furniture and crystal chandelier was abandoned in favor of this more intimate space where pretense fell away in the face of urgent necessity. Here, surrounded by the honest simplicity of functional cabinetry and well-used appliances, they pieced together the elaborate conspiracy that had brought a billionaire to his knees and stripped away the empire he had spent decades building. Rosa produced evidence from hiding places throughout the mansion, documents tucked behind baseboards, flash drives concealed in hollowed-out books, photographs stored in the false bottom of her modest jewelry box, a treasure trove of information gathered with patient determination by a woman who had been systematically underestimated by everyone who encountered her in her role as a maid. "I started putting money aside the first year I worked for you," Rosa explained, as she sorted papers into meticulous piles, each representing a different strand of the complex web of betrayal they were untangling. "Not because I suspected anything then, but because that's what my father taught me. Always have a contingency fund, always be prepared for the ground to shift beneath your feet." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, the same hands that had polished his silver and pressed his shirts, now wielding financial evidence with unexpected expertise. "When things started to feel wrong about 3 years ago, little comments from your partners that didn't sit right, documents left carelessly visible that contradicted what they were telling you to your face, I began setting aside more, working additional jobs on my days off, investing carefully in small, stable opportunities that flew beneath the radar." She looked up, meeting his gaze with the directness that still startled him after years of deferential interactions. "I've accumulated enough to fund a proper legal challenge and hire investigators who can trace the money they diverted. Not to maintain this lifestyle, of course." She gestured around them at the kitchen that, while high-end, represented the most modest corner of his vast estate, "but enough to fight back, to clear your name, to rebuild something authentic from the ashes they've left." The revelation of Rosa's financial acumen further shattered Christopher's perception of the woman who had moved through his life like a benevolent shadow for nearly 2 decades. He had never inquired about her education or background, assuming based on her occupation that she had limited options and abilities, an assumption that now shamed him as he watched her expertly analyze complex financial structures and identify vulnerabilities in the case against him that his high-priced attorneys had overlooked or deliberately ignored. "I studied accounting at night school while working days as a house cleaner for your first wife's cousin," she told him when he finally asked, the question emerging awkwardly as he confronted his own prejudices. "Graduated with honors but couldn't break into the field. Wrong background, wrong connections, wrong look for the front office." Indeed, the absence of bitterness in her tone was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her revelation, the simple statement of fact delivered without the rancor he might have expected from someone whose talents had been systematically overlooked based on superficial factors beyond her control. Their days developed a rhythm as Christopher's remaining assets were systematically frozen or seized, leaving them operating from an increasingly precarious position within the mansion that would soon be lost to creditors circling like vultures over the carcass of his former prosperity. Rosa reached out through networks Christopher had never known existed. Former household staff from neighboring estates, service workers who moved invisibly through the halls of power, administrative assistants who were privy to sensitive information yet considered too insignificant to pose any threat to the machinations of the wealthy and influential. These overlooked individuals became their most valuable sources, providing access to conversations and documents that would otherwise have remained hidden behind the walls of privilege and power. The irony was not lost on Christopher that his salvation might come from the very people he and his peers had treated as functional non-entities. human infrastructure to be utilized, but never truly acknowledged. In the evenings, when exhaustion dulled their effectiveness and the weight of the challenge before them seemed most insurmountable, they would sometimes sit in companionable silence on the terrace that overlooked gardens now showing signs of neglect, without the team of landscapers who had maintained their manicured perfection. These quiet moments revealed yet another dimension to their evolving relationship, a comfort in shared silence that Christopher had never experienced with the socialites and status seekers who had populated his previous life. Rosa would occasionally share stories of her childhood in a working-class neighborhood across the city, of parents who had instilled in her a fierce work ethic and uncompromising integrity, of dreams deferred but never abandoned, as she navigated a world that offered limited opportunities to someone of her background and circumstances. Christopher found himself sharing in return, not the carefully curated anecdotes he had deployed at dinner parties to charm and impress, but honest reflections on the loneliness that had paradoxically intensified as his wealth and status grew, the hollowness of achievements that brought accolades but no genuine connection, the realization that he had surrounded himself with people who valued what he represented rather than who he was. On the 15th day of their unlikely partnership, as autumn sunlight cast long shadows across the terrace and a slight chill in the air hinted at the approaching change of seasons, Christopher finally asked the question that had lingered unspoken between them as they worked side by side to reclaim what had been stolen from him. Why did you stay when everyone else left? Why invest years of your life gathering evidence to protect someone who never even properly saw you? The vulnerability in his voice was new, the armor of arrogance and certainty stripped away by circumstances that had revealed the fragility beneath his carefully constructed facade of invincibility. Rosa was silent for several long moments, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the sun was beginning its descent in a spectacle of color that no amount of wealth could purchase or control. When she finally turned to him, her expression held a complexity of emotion that transcended simple categorization, not pity, not admiration, but something more profound that spoke to recognition of shared humanity beneath the artificial barriers of class and circumstance that had separated them for so long.